This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our focus, contemporary spirituality. And our guest today, Jorge Ferrer. He is a professor of East-West psychology, integral and transpersonal psychology at the School of Consciousness and Transformation. He's at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I want to let our listeners know that I'm in Iowa. My co-host Phil Goldberg is in Los Angeles, and Jorge is in the beautiful city of Barcelona, and he's in an ancient monastery. So if you hear like an echo chamber, he's in the cell of a famous monk. That's actually not true, but it may sound a little like that. But I think it's still miraculous that the three of us, can have a conversation in three different parts of the world, many thousands of miles away from each other. Jorge, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. And likewise, it's amazing that we can have this conversation this way.
It is an echo chamber. Jorge, perhaps for the sake of our listeners who are not familiar with you and your work, give us a little bit about your background. You've become an important figure in transpersonal psychology, but you were born in Spain and ended up in San Francisco. Tell us a little bit about your own spiritual history and what got you into transpersonal psychology.
Yes, I think my interest into spirituality and differences of consciousness started with a number of different experiences I underwent when I was like a little boy and also pre-adolescent. When I was in a school, maybe I would be like 10 or 11 years old. I would go into some kind of like trance-like states in the classroom. I would be in a place of light and peace. And the teacher would wake me up and I would cry. And they thought I was epileptic. They took me to the psychologist. They did some testing. They realized I was not epileptic. And that left like some kind of interest into states of consciousness. I knew there was something there really beautiful. And then afterwards, in my pre-adolescent, I started having spontaneous out-of-body experiences. And I was very scared of them at first because there was nothing that had prepared me for that experience of experiencing myself outside of my body and looking at my body from above. And it took many years until I became more familiar with those experiences that I don't have very much these days, actually. So it was those experiences plus my awareness already in my adolescence of certain purely neurotic patterns and areas of myself that needed to be healed that took me into the study of psychology. And when I reached mainstream psychology in Barcelona, of course, I didn't, I was looking for both healing and understanding of those states. And of course, I didn't receive none of them, I didn't receive healing studying scientific psychology at the university, and the understanding of those states was more a pathologizing one. Mm-hmm. They were called depersonalization, dissociative disorders, and I knew that didn't match my experience. Right. So it took me a number of years, like looking more self-directed study until I found through reading, through Carl Gustav Jung and Eric Fromm, and I found Zen Buddhism, and I eventually found the discipline of transpersonal psychology. And there was like a subfield of psychology that had like a non-pathological understanding of many of those states that really matched more my own experience. Right. And that was the beginning of my search into transpersonal psychology.
Right. Jorge, much of your life work and research was inspired by your experiences in the earlier part of your life, mostly, you said, of these deep inner spiritual experiences that you didn't have. We recently interviewed a woman, Kimberly Braun, similar, had these profound spiritual experiences as a child. She wound up becoming a Carmelite nun and then moved on from there, where she is no longer in the monastery but teaches. And again, her life very much directed because of these early experiences. In your teaching, in your research, have you encountered many people like yourself who at an early stage in life or some part of their life had these experiences that modern psychology, psychoanalysis, whatever, could not explain, so they had to seek other areas to understand their experience?
Yes, absolutely, yes. I would say that 80% of all the students that arrive to CIS, they have had some kind of experiences. I mean, I would even argue that most, if not all children, they do have some kind of experiences that could be considered kind of spiritual states, but they are not, they're later repressed or not remembered, or sometimes they are like framed in ways that the same people, they understand it differently, Oh, that was like something that happened to me that day in nature, but it's not something that has nothing to do with what people are calling it spiritual, So definitively, I would say so.
Phil?
Jorge, just for the sake of people who are not familiar with the field of transpersonal psychology, maybe you could give us just a brief sort of synopsis of what the emphasis of that field of research is and how it came into being.
Absolutely, my pleasure. The field was born in the late 60s, and it was born in California. And that was a place and a time in which there was like this very rich confluence of many different trends. And I think that there were three that they were the most important for the birth of transpersonal psychology. One was the counterculture of the 60s, and also including the tremendous experimentation with psychedelic substances, LSD and magic mushrooms and morning glory and many other things. That was happening there. And then at the same time, there was also the entry, and you have documented field is beautiful in your book, American Veda. There was like tremendous influx of Eastern spiritual traditions in those years that started before, but it kind of was picking up in the 60s and 70s. Eastern traditions were coming into the West. Eastern gurus were arriving to California, and then all that kind of got together with the field of humanistic psychology, the work of Han Maslow that was talking about, not so much about what's wrong about the person, but what about a psychology that studies what is good about the person, what we can become, the further reaches of human nature, self-actualization, what he called peak experiences, the happiest, joyous moments, So out of this kind of, three-sided influx, some psychologists started kind of like putting things together, Many people, for example, have had quite dramatically spiritual experiences, different states of consciousness during psychedelics, when they start reading like Eastern traditions, descriptions of different states like nirvana or moksha, and satori in the literature, they start really finding parallels, and that's one of that correspondence between the descriptions in the Eastern traditions and some of the experiences that people were having with psychedelics in the 60s and 70s. That was like a very important source of the field,
Mm-hmm.
So the field devoted itself for many decades now to the study of states of consciousness, the states of being that go beyond our conventional development. For more mainstream psychology to become a mature, functional egoic personality is what is the top. Although now there is the field of positive psychology,
Right.
but until a few years ago, there was nothing more. I think it was Freud who said, the more we can do is to substitute the tremendous misery of the neurotic for the everyday unhappiness of everyday life, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah, Jorge, let me ask you. You're touching upon the subject now of uh, doing things, external or internal, to bring on these experiences. And you are a leading scholar on transformative practices. What are some of the transformative practices that you have used or currently use that you find effective? And are these things you can teach to other people?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a tricky question. Because my sense, I'm happy to share a bit about my trajectory in that regard, but I'm always hesitant because my sense that it's important for people to really find their own practices, the practices that resonate with their own potentials. I take the view that I defend this notion that I call it spiritual individuation. Normally people talk about psychological individuation, but spiritual individuation is like, the capability to become your own unique embodiment of the mystery or reality or the divine, whatever you want to call it. And the path can be drastically different from many different people. I'm always very struck and astonished, when I hear about the tremendous diversity of spiritual trajectories. Some people went from being a Christian monk and then they went into Buddhism. Other people went from Buddhism to shamanism and to environmental spirituality and so forth, So for me, what matters is not so much the specific practices themselves, but the cash fruits, Are they making you a more available, kinder human being? Are you becoming a more integrated person, less dissociations, less blocks within your being? Are you becoming a more active, transformative agent in the world towards making this place a more eco-socially and political just and fair for everybody, But in regard to my path, what I would say is that I was educated in Barcelona in a Christian school, and as many people of my generation who were educated in Christianity, we rejected Christianity, and I went into first Buddhism, different forms of Zen. They were very important. Then also Vipassana. I was in the Buddhist world for about 15 years. And at the same time, I was doing a lot of explorations into shamanism and also work with teacher plants such as ayahuasca. At some point, I found the cactus San Pedro in Peru, and actually, I became a San Pedrista, although not that many people know about it. In my book, for the first time, I come out of the closet in that way, sharing some of my own entheogenic experiences with San Pedro, And at the same time, the last thing I will say, I don't want to talk too much. The last thing I will say is there is this body of work that I talk about it in the book, in the chapter on integral practices, that is called holistic transformation. It was called holistic sexuality. That is a very integral approach in which people engage into interactive embodied meditations. Meditation practice normally, as you know, has been normally taking place in solitude, or if it's with people with no contact with other people, except some tantric practices and a few others. But these are kind of like very mindful, structured practices in which people engage with certain forms of physical contact between their chakras, for example. And I found them tremendously powerful and very, very enriching.
Phil?
Jorge, let's get to the most recent book you published called Participation and the Mystery. You have broken some new ground in your field with your theories having to do with participatory spirituality. For the sake of our audience who are not academics.
Yes. Thank you.
And for us, yeah.
And for us, what do you mean by participatory spirituality, and how is that different from the way we are accustomed to looking at things?
Yes, I think it's a question of emphasis, and I'm always very clear that I'm not into the business of creating any kind of a school or movement, but kind of giving voice to what I feel is like an increasing scholarly but also spiritual sensitivity that I see both within and outside the traditions, also in the greater movements of the spiritual but not religious people in the world. And it's a sensitivity that I think emphasizes the more relational aspects of spirituality and also the more embodied aspects of spirituality and also the more creative aspects of spirituality. So in a way, a simple way to talk about participation is to talk about co-creation. Co-creation, like for example, and spirituality that is co-created by all human dimensions. Many spiritualities of the past, they emphasize the cultivation of the heart and consciousness, for example, but very often they're regulated or repressed or kind of like marginalized in different ways, the body or sexuality or instincts. And I believe that today the spiritual zeitgeist, so to speak, is one that is about embracing all human dimensions in an integrated way. So that's one way in which I talk about participatory, and also participatory in the sense of like co-creation between beings. We are in a radically relational world, with other human beings, with non-human beings, animals, plants, perhaps also with non-human entities, if you are open to those possibilities existing in more imaginal realms of reality or subtle dimensions, But that radical relationality, I think it's very important. We're co-creating. It's not just, lone cowboy spirituality doing your own thing. You're always in relationship. And then lastly, and this is perhaps the most radical, and some people have a bit more resistance, is the one that we're also co-creating with the mystery itself. And the mystery, I call the mystery to that kind of creative, generative force of life, reality, or the cosmos. It's a very minimal definition. You can understand that in more naturalistic terms, more supernaturalistic terms, but it's that creative force, that is behind the cosmos, perhaps the Big Bang or the endless universes that the cosmologists talk about now, life, that energy, So we can co-create with that energy as well. And as many mystics, both Christians and also Kabbalistics and from other traditions, they would say that it's not just us that we are kind of growing and with spiritual pursuits, but that the divine itself was being affected. The divine itself, the mystery itself is also part of this co-creative relationship.
Jorge, you mentioned before San Pedro, and I think you referred to ayahuasca. We have had a couple of interviews. One with Anthony Bossas, who's a psychologist at New York University.
Oh, I know him.
That's doing it. Yeah, wonderful man. We have an interview with him, and also we recently interviewed Rachel Harris, who wrote a book on, I think it's called Listening to Ayahuasca, and she's also doing research in that area. And she mentioned to us, if I remember correctly, that there was research being done in Spain, and I think she might have even mentioned Barcelona on ayahuasca. Yes. Are you familiar with that research, and do you think it has promise for bringing people greater spirituality? And at the same time, should people be very careful with that, because are there dangers involved?
Yes, that's good. There are many aspects to that question, and some of the researchers that you are mentioning here in Barcelona, they are among my close friends, Jose Carlos Bozo and other people here in some organizations here. So on the one hand, I respect very much their work, and also I've always felt very a bit ambiguous about this kind of scientific research, in the sense that this scientific research, on the one hand, is bringing the value that brings like social legitimacy, social legitimation to those substances, and at some point they will be able to be used, by trained psychotherapists and psychiatrists in healing, and that's very beneficial, because there are substances that they are not addictive, they don't have like secondary side effects, for example, antidepressives, that can lead to suicide and other things. And actually they are very effective, in a few sessions, they can really heal tremendously people. That's why the pharmaceutical companies are very also ambiguous towards them, because it's not something that they can create pills and people are going to need pills all the time. In a few sessions, it's over. And on the other hand, also there is tensions, because many of these substances that I'm researching with, they are coming from sacred plants, from cultivated and held in secret containers all around the world, in the jungle, in the Amazons, for example, and in many other places, in the Mazatecas with mushrooms and saliva, and then there is tensions here because these people are, as usual, they're not going to get anything. When some people here are going to start making a lot of money, when they, they create pills or they create like something here, out of those substances, So I'm ambiguous. I think that it's a good thing. At the same time, I think there is some potential shadows in the process.
Jorge, I want to come back for a moment to your participatory spirituality.
Sure.
I'm looking at the back of your book, at the jacket copy, and it says that you have an original solution to the problem of religious pluralism. So the first question is, what is the problem with religious pluralism, and what is the original solution that your work points?
Yes. Well, the problem has been, it has not been pluralism itself. It has been that, as you know, there has been, there is probably over 10,000 independent religions in the world today, according to the statistics, and many of them, most of them actually, they held very conflicting viewpoints about the nature of reality, the nature of the divine, the nature of the origins of things, the nature of the human being, So this leads us to what Hawking, these philosophers talk about, the scandal of plurality. Like the consent that if there is so many different visions, spiritual visions of what the divine is or what the reality is, perhaps none of them is right? And what to make of that, there is like hundreds and hundreds of cosmologies and cosmovisions, and then normally the typical responses that you are familiar with, are responses that trying to, inclusivist approaches, like, Ken Wilber was one of those in the transpersonal movement, like, for example, pyramidal approaches in which they will arrange the different insights, the different cosmologies, different kind of steps towards like ultimate realization that could be framed in different ways, like non-duality or God or pure consciousness, and other people would say, well, no, this is like the famous story of the different blind men and the elephant, right? They would say, well, there is like an elephant, and some people will touch the trunk, the ears, and then it will be like this kind of perspectivism, different perspectives, different snapshots of the same ground of being, The problem with that view, I think, is that it projects this very almost naively scientific objectivism to a spiritual reality, as if there is one thing that exists and is predetermined, is objective, and can be seen from different places or perspectives, So none of these solutions are, I think, helpful, and also they create a lot of interreligious tensions. Interreligious tensions, of course, are created by a plethora of other reasons, ethnic, economic, political. But when you believe that you have God on your side, or your tradition is the truest one, it gets easier to be violent or to kill your neighbor. And some authors have spoken about this, have written books about this, how the rhetoric of religious exclusivism fuels fundamentalism and violence across the world, So basically, all these maps, also you have the esotericist, thesis, that traditions would be exoteric, diverse, different, in their manifestations. But if you go into the mystical, if you go into the esoteric core, they will become more and more similar. And there is something there, but I think also if you are a student of mysticism and esotericism, you realize about the tremendous diversity that exists within the mystical cores of the traditions themselves, And so basically, my approach is more like it's like to turn around things. It's like well, perhaps it's not like there are different rivers going to the same peak of the mountain, or reaching the same ocean. It's like it's very likely that there are different mountains, there are different peaks. Traditions are going to different places. I like the image of the tree with different branches branching out in different spiritual, creative directions, and many of the branches can overlap. So there is many points in common within the traditions, but they are offering us different solutions, different solutions and different creative enactions and different creative cosmologies, and if there is something that is where we can find the unity, I would go with what Rumi once said. Rumi once said in a different context, he said, well, maybe you have been looking into the branches, what it can only be found in the roots. And that's where I would go. Right. I would say like that creative root, what I call the mystery, that undetermined creative energy, we are coming from there, that's where we can find some kind of sort of unity, like members of a different family, we come from the same root, but then, it's important, I think, to allow this spiritual individuation of different traditions and people, and celebrate it. And then it's not a problem anymore.
Right.
Jorge, so wait, can I follow up on that, Dennis? Ahead. So if you acknowledge that there are roots that all the branches have in common, how is that different from the perennial, what's called perennialism, which was basically the same thing about mystical experience?
Well, for me, it's different for two reasons. Because, the perennialist view, on the one hand, is like saying that that unity is at the mystical core, different traditions, contemplatives from different places, they would just, if they advance enough in their development, in the contemplative development, they will go to similar places, even though they interpret it differently. I think that's a distortion. I think the space of Brahma or the loving God or sunyata, emptiness, are not the same experiences. And people in the intermonastic dialogue are corroborating that as well. Textually, phenomenologically, I think that's problematic. It's very different when you say, we're all in contact with a creative energy, and in contact with this energy, we're co-creating in different directions, that are both existential, soteriological, different forms of human liberation from self-centeredness, but also perhaps that are kind of co-creating like different spiritual worlds, subtle dimensions.
Jorge, is there a particular branch on that tree of religions that you are attracted to? Is there one you associate with more than the others?
That's a great question. I love so much from so many different traditions, I think that I tend to believe that different traditions historically have kind of cultivated beautifully different human potentials and skills, different competences, So I think that that's part of the richness of our times, of the interreligious dialogue, because they all have something to learn and something to offer, Some traditions are fantastic at, contemplative skills. Others are great about spiritual relationship with nature, Others are great about kind of mind-body integration, So my sense is that the religions of the future, the spirituals of the future, is already starting to happen. We're in the infancy of this kind of multi-traditional spiritualities that are emerging today, but those spiritualities will be kind of like relying on many insights from many different traditions. Personally, I'm a San Pedrista, so I work with this plant, this cacti called San Pedro, but there is not much of a cosmology there, and it's just a healing work. It's a healing work, and it's beautiful, and it has opened my eyes to many things that
let me just ask
that were possible. Yes.
Jorge, is that the same as ayahuasca?
No, the San Pedro cactus also grows in Peru and also South America, Bolivia, and also Argentina, other places. There are 14 species, but the one that grows in Peru is one of the particularly visionary types. So it's like a cactus. Ayahuasca is a combination of plants from the Amazons. San Pedro grows in the Sierras, in the sun. So it's a plant that ayahuasca can take you to heaven, to hell. It's called the vine of the death. Could people at some point you need to face your fears, psychosis, death, It's very valuable, of course, but could be terrifying. San Pedro is more of the light and consciousness. It holds you like a gentle grandfather, does not deconstruct your sense of individuality or functional ego, and then your perception opens, your heart opens, your consciousness opens. And one of the phenomena I described in the book that for me was mind-blowing is that sometimes the visionary dimension You can see things with your eyes open, but not by yourself. Other people can see the same things that you are saying. Vortex of energies, entities. So these are intersubjective agreement possible in visionary experience with San Pedro that I've never seen with any other plant.
Jorge, Dennis,
Yes.
did you want?
Yeah, go ahead.
Jorge, you're working at a university that attracts a certain kind of student who's interested in the spiritual dimension for the most part, and psychology. Things are very different now for young people who are spiritual seekers than they were 20, 40, 60 years ago.
Yes.
For one thing, the opportunities for exploration are vast. I mean, everything's available now, and when you speak of thousands of pathways and traditions and so forth, is it confusing to people who are new to a spiritual path to be exposed to all this? Whereas in the past, people came to their spirituality basically through local traditions and
Yes.
local teachers and family traditions and so forth. Obviously, there would be advantages to having all this freedom of exploration and choice, but it can also, I would imagine, be mind-boggling. So,
Yes.
what is your perception of the current spiritual scene, especially for young people?
That's a great question. Thanks. It's interesting because I think you are right. It can be confusing. It can be confusing, and that's why all those kind of frameworks that or universalist frameworks that tends to arrange traditions in a particular order. They at first it gives some meaning and some sense of order to many young students. That they encounter this diversity and it's like, wow, what to believe. There is all these different beliefs, all these different understandings, like what to make sense of this. And then of course there is I've been living in the Bay Area of California for the last 23 years. And as you know, the tremendous diversity of approaches and spiritualities that coexist there is tremendous, So on the one hand, one would expect to see more confusion. I don't know, in our students at least, I see that increasingly that they kind of forge their own individual path, in conversation with all those traditions. We help them to do that as well, We presented different traditions, not in an indoctrinating manner, but in a respectful way so that they can resonate with one thing or the other, And of course, there is always the concern of also, what has been called the spiritual cafeteria model, I pick up from here, I pick up from there, and it gets like this very superficial thing that people can never go deep, into a particular spirituality, and that can happen, but it's tricky. I've seen everything. I've seen people, in a very single tradition, very devoted, who also stay in a very superficial level. And I've seen people who also are more eclectic, and some of them are superficial, and some of them are tremendously profound. It really depends also on the level of psychological integration. It's not so much the what is being selected, but who and how is being who is selecting it and how it's being integrated in a person.
Very good.
Jorge, thank you so very much for your time today. Are there any final points you'd like to share with our listeners, and any book you have out or coming out soon that you'd like to let our listeners know about, and any way they can follow up on your research and work?
Thank you. I would like just to say that, the book that is available now is the hardcover, but I just learned from my editors at SUNY Press, Institute of University of New York Press, that the paperback edition is going to come out as soon as in January. So I'm very happy about that, to be able to make it available to a greater number of readers, because as you know, hardcovers are very difficult to access. And right now I'm working hard on another book on more on relationships, and spirituality and sexuality, and kind of like trying to map out the territory that lies beyond monogamy and polyamory, in the same way that the transgender movement did for gender, masculine and feminine. What lies beyond that binary? So I'm working hard on that these days.
Very
Well, that sounds like fun.
Yes.
and I want to, Phil, you finish up, and I want to remind our listeners that Jorge, that echoey sound comes from the ancient monastery he has
Yes.
been residing in for the last 40. No, he's in Barcelona, and in a room that. But it's still miraculous that we can be in Iowa, Los Angeles, and Barcelona and have this conversation. And I must say, if anybody hasn't been to Barcelona, please go there. It's one of the great cities in the world.
I totally support that thought, and yes, it's a beautiful city. You'll not regret it.
I agree. And you can even go to ancient monasteries like the one in Montserrat.
Yes, with the Black Madonna.
Well, thanks again, Jorge. It's a delight to talk to you, and enjoy your time in Barcelona, and I hope we connect back in California.
Thank you so much, both of you, and thanks for your very, very thoughtful questions, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.